The wind did not howl, it screamed. It was a high, thin sound that vibrated in the marrow of the bone, a constant reminder that beyond the rough-hewn logs of the cabin, the world had been reduced to killing intent. Caleb Thorne sat in the center of the room, his back to the cast-iron stove, listening to the timber of the shack groan under the assault. It was Christmas Eve, 1885, though the date held little weight here in Devil's Gap. Here the calendar was measured only in degrees of cold and depth of snow. Caleb was a man carved from the same hard geography as the mountains that imprisoned him. 35 years old, with hands roughened by rope and leather, and eyes the color of flint that had seen too much of the war and too little of kindness since. He scraped the bottom of a tin plate, finishing the last of the salted beef, the metal spoon ringing out with a lonely clarity in the small space. The cabin smelled of pine pitch, stale tobacco, and the wet wool of his drying socks, the perfume of a bachelorhood that wasn't a choice, but a sentence. He reached for the coffee pot, the black liquid inside thick as oil, and poured a cup. His hand was steady. It was always steady. Outside, the blizzard was burying the Wyoming Territory under 5 feet of white, erasing trails, landmarks, and mercy. Caleb took a sip of the bitter coffee and stared at the frosted glass of the single window. He was alone. And for the first time in years, the silence of the room felt heavier than the snow piling up against the door. The storm had begun 3 hours ago as a grey bruising on the northern horizon, but it had descended with the speed of a falling guillotine. Now the temperature was plummeting, dropping so fast the nails in the cabin walls popped with sharp pistol crack reports as the wood contracted. Caleb knew this kind of weather. The old-timers called it a widowmaker. It was the kind of whiteout that could turn a man around in 10 feet and freeze his lungs before he found his way back. He should have been asleep, resting for the brutal work of digging out the cattle that would begin at dawn, but something in the air kept him awake. A tension, an electric charge that prickled the hair on his arms. He stood up, his tall frame nearly brushing the low beams of the ceiling, and walked to the door. He placed a hand against the wood. It was freezing to the touch, ice forming on the inside latch. He checked the bar, ensuring it was seated deep. He had supplies, enough beans, coffee, and a prized can of peaches for tomorrow to last a week. He was safe. He was warm. He told himself he was content. But as he turned back to the stove, the wind shifted. It dropped for a single, breathless second, creating a vacuum of silence that was more terrifying than the noise. And in that gap, he heard it. It wasn't the cry of a wolf, nor the snap of a frozen pine branch. It was a sound that had no business existing in this hellscape. It was the frantic, high-pitched scream of a horse, followed by the sickening, splintering crunch of oak smashing against granite. Caleb froze. The sound had come from the pass, perhaps a quarter-mile east, where the trail narrowed between 2 cliffs before dropping into the valley. No one rode the pass in December. Not the stagecoach, not the mail rider, not even a fool. But his ears didn't lie. The sound of the crash had been unmistakable, the heavy, percussive thud of weight meeting rock. He waited, straining against the return of the wind, listening for a human voice, a cry, anything. There was nothing but the rising shriek of the gale. He looked at the fire, warm and inviting. He looked at his bunk, piled high with furs. To go out there now was suicide. A man could die in minutes if he lost his way. But Caleb Thorne was many things, hard, cynical, tired. But he was not a man who could sit by the fire while something died in the dark. He moved with sudden, practiced efficiency. He grabbed the heavy buffalo hide coat from its peg, the weight of it settling onto his shoulders like armor. He wound a thick wool scarf around his face, leaving only a slit for his eyes. He lit the hurricane lantern, the flame hissing as he pressurized the fuel, casting a harsh yellow glare that pushed back the shadows. He grabbed a coil of rope, 50 feet of hemp, and slung it over his shoulder. He checked his belt knife. He didn't take a gun. You couldn't shoot the wind. He moved to the door and paused, his gloved hand on the iron latch. He took a breath, holding it in his chest, preparing his body for the shock. Then he threw the latch and kicked the door open. The storm didn't just enter, it attacked. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of ice and fury that tried to drive him back inside. The lantern light swung wildly, illuminating nothing but a swirling vortex of white that looked like a waterfall of snow. Caleb leaned into it, lowering his head like a bull, and stepped over the threshold. The cold was instant and shocking, needle-sharp, finding the smallest gaps in his clothing. He slammed the door behind him, struggling against the pressure until it latched, cutting off the warmth of his life. Now there was only the storm. He turned east, toward the sound of the crash, and began to walk. The snow was already thigh-deep, sucking at his boots, making every step a labor. He couldn't see the trees. He couldn't see the sky. He navigated by the slope of the ground and the gut instinct of a man who had survived the wild for a decade. Left foot, right foot, breathe. The lantern was a pathetic glowworm in the vastness of the dark, lighting only his boots. He shouted, "Hello!" But the wind tore the word from his mouth and swallowed it whole. He pushed on, the cold already numbing his fingers, driven by a terrible curiosity to see what kind of ghost had come to haunt him on Christmas Eve. Caleb fought the storm for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only minutes. Time had frozen along with the landscape. The snow was no longer just falling, it was driving horizontally, shards of ice that scoured any exposed skin like sandpaper. He was walking blind, his eyelashes thick with ice, navigating solely by the sickening drop in the terrain that marked the edge of the ravine. He nearly walked right off it. His boot slipped on the rim, sending a shower of loose rock and snow tumbling into the dark void below. He dropped to his knees, bracing himself against the gale, and swung the lantern out over the precipice. The yellow light struggled to penetrate the swirling white, but then it caught a reflection, metal. Down in the belly of the cut, wedged between a massive boulder and a snapped pine tree, lay the twisted carcass of a conquered stagecoach. It lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the wind, a black beetle crushed by a giant's thumb. The driver was nowhere to be seen, likely thrown clear and buried deep by the drift. The horses were a tangle of dark shapes in the snow, still and silent. Caleb didn't hesitate. He secured his rope to a sturdy stump on the rim and slid down the embankment, sliding more than climbing, the shale tearing at his coat. He landed hard against the side of the coach, the impact jarring his teeth, and scrambled up the slick, varnished wood to reach the passenger door that was now facing the sky. He hammered on the door with the hilt of his knife, shouting to be heard over the screaming wind, but there was no answer. The latch was frozen solid, encased in a shell of ice. Caleb cursed, a raw sound in his throat, and jammed the knife blade into the gap, leveraging it with all his strength. With a screech of tortured metal that sounded like a gunshot, the lock gave way. He heaved the door upward, the wind catching it and nearly ripping it from his grip, and peered into the dark belly of the coach. He expected to find a corpse. He expected a grizzled miner or a mail clerk. He did not expect her. The lantern light spilled into the velvet-lined interior, illuminating a scene that made Caleb blink, certain the cold was making him hallucinate. Huddled in the far corner, half buried in a drift of snow that had poured in through a shattered window, was a woman. She was not dressed for the territory. She wore no furs, no wool, no heavy boots. She was draped in a gown of crimson silk, the fabric shimmering wetly in the light. A shocking, violent splash of red in a world of grey and white. It was a dress meant for a San Francisco ballroom, not a Wyoming blizzard. Her skin was the colour of marble, pale and perfect, her dark hair spilling over her face in wet tangles. She looked like a broken doll thrown away by a careless child. Caleb dropped into the carriage, the floor tilted at a crazy angle. The air inside smelled of expensive lavender perfume and the copper tang of fear, a jarring contrast to the clean, frozen scent of the storm. He reached for her, his rough, bare-paw gloves clumsy against the delicate silk. "Ma'am!" he roared, shaking her shoulder. She didn't move. Her head lolled back, her lips blue, ice crystals dusting her eyelashes like diamonds. She was alive, but barely. The cold had already sunk its teeth deep into her core. He couldn't leave her here, not even for a minute to check for others. The coach was a coffin waiting to be sealed by the snow. He had to move. He stripped off his heavy buffalo coat, a dangerous gamble that exposed him to the biting wind, and wrapped it around her, engulfing her small frame in the thick, animal-smelling warmth. He scooped her up, her weight negligible against his strength, though her dead weight made her awkward to handle. She was limp, a bundle of red silk and cold flesh. He hoisted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, grunting as he stood up on the slanted floor. Climbing out of the coach with her was a nightmare of slipping boots and strained muscles, but he hauled them both up and out, back into the teeth of the gale. The climb back up the ravine wall was a blur of agony. Caleb tied the rope around his waist and hers, binding them together like mountain climbers, and clawed his way up the slope. The wind tried to peel them off the rock face, battering them with gusts that threatened to knock him flat. Every step was a battle of will against physics. His lungs burned as if he were inhaling glass. His legs, thigh-deep in drifts, screamed with lactic acid. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. He could only feel the weight of the woman on his back, the only source of heat in the universe. He focused on that, the burden of her life keeping him anchored to the earth. Don't stop, don't fall. If you stop, you both die. He reached the rim and hauled them over, collapsing for a second into the snow, gasping for air that wouldn't come, but he forced himself up. The tracks he had made coming here were already gone, erased by the wind. He had to navigate by the wind direction and sheer stubbornness. He marched, a golem of ice and determination, carrying the girl in the red dress through the white void. When the dark shape of the cabin finally materialized out of the snow, it looked like a hallucination. He stumbled the last 50 yards, his knees buckling, and crashed against the door. He fumbled for the latch with hands that felt like blocks of wood, kicked the door open, and fell inside, dragging her with him. He kicked the door shut against the wind, and the sudden silence of the room was so loud it made his ears ring. They were alive. The transition from the screaming violence of the storm to the stillness of the cabin was jarring, like stepping out of a waterfall into a tomb. Caleb didn't have time to rest. He dropped to his knees before the cast-iron stove, his hands shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed and the cold reclaimed his blood. He fed the dying embers with dry pine needles and split logs, blowing on the coals until they roared back to life, the iron belly of the stove ticking as it heated. The room began to glow with a pulsing orange light, pushing the shadows back into the corners. Caleb turned to the bundle on the floor. The buffalo coat was soaked with snow that was rapidly melting into puddles on the rough planks. He peeled the heavy leather back to reveal the woman. She was trembling. A vibration so violent her teeth clicked together with a sound like rattling dice. Her skin was the color of skimmed milk, and her lips were a terrifying shade of violet. Caleb knew the signs. If he didn't get her warm immediately, her heart would simply stop. He looked at the red silk dress, plastered to her skin by the melting snow. It was a beautiful, impractical thing, a cage of wet fabric that was killing her. He took a breath, steeling himself, and reached for the buttons running down her back. His hands, clumsy with cold and calloused from barbed wire, struggled with the tiny pearl buttons. They were puzzles of civilization that had no place in the wild. He worked with a grim, clinical focus, trying to ignore the softness of her skin beneath his rough knuckles. This wasn't intimacy. It was a medical necessity. As the sodden silk peeled away, he saw the map of her trauma. Her shoulder was mottled with a dark purple bruise where she had struck the carriage wall. Her knees were scraped raw. He stripped her down to her chemise and corset, garments of lace and whalebone that seemed absurdly fragile here. He grabbed his thickest wool blanket, rough and scratchy but warm, and wrapped her tightly, tucking the ends under her to create a cocoon. He dragged his mattress closer to the fire and lifted her onto it, arranging the furs over her until she was buried under a mountain of warmth. Then, and only then, did he attend to himself. He stripped off his own soaked layers, shivering in his long johns, and hung the red dress from a rafter near the stove. It hung there, limp and dripping, a crimson ghost haunting his bachelor quarters, dripping water onto the floor with a steady, hypnotic plip, plip, plip. Time passed in the rhythmic crackle of the fire. Caleb sat in his chair, cleaning his knife, watching the rise and fall of the mound of blankets. Around midnight, the rhythm changed. A gasp, sharp and sudden, broke the silence. The blankets shifted, and a head emerged, hair wild and drying into dark curls. Her eyes snapped open, wide and panicked, darting around the room before locking onto him. In the firelight, Caleb knew what he looked like. A giant, bearded and scarred, sharpening a blade in a dark room while a storm raged outside. He saw the terror spike in her eyes, the way she shrank back against the wall, clutching the blanket to her throat. She looked at the door, then back at him, calculating odds that didn't exist. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice cracked and dry. "Where am I?" She didn't sound grateful, she sounded cornered. She sounded like a woman who had learned to expect the worst from men. "Name's Thorne," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He didn't stop cleaning the knife. "You're in Devil's Gap. Found you in the ravine. Your coach went over." She blinked, the memory of the crash colliding with the reality of the room. She looked down at her bare shoulders, then at the red dress hanging above the fire like a skinned pelt. A flush of shame, or perhaps anger, rose in her cheeks. "My driver," she started, then stopped. "Dead," Caleb said flatly. There was no point in lying. "Storm buried him. Horses too." She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracking through the soot on her cheek, but she didn't scream. She didn't break. That surprised him. "I need to go," she said, opening her eyes. "I need to get to Laramie. They'll be looking for me." She made a move to sit up, to throw off the blankets, but the effort made her sway dizzily. "You ain't going nowhere," Caleb said, sheathing the knife with a definitive click. He stood up, towering over the small space, and walked to the window. It was completely white, a sheet of ice sealing them in. "Listen to that," he gestured to the walls, where the wind was still battering the logs. "That's a widowmaker out there, 5 feet of snow and dropping, trails gone, passes blocked." He turned back to look at her, seeing the realization sink in. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a heavy, crushing exhaustion. "We're stuck, ma'am. Just you, me, and the fire. Might be days." She looked at him, really looked at him then, assessing the threat he posed versus the threat outside. She was a creature of ballrooms and parlors, trapped in a wolf's den, but there was a steel in her jaw that Caleb hadn't noticed before. "Evelyn," she said softly, offering the name like a bargaining chip. "My name is Evelyn." Caleb nodded once, accepting the truce. He went to the stove and ladled soup from a pot, canned beans and beef thickened with flour. He held the bowl out to her. "Eat," he ordered, not unkindly. "You lost a lot of heat. Need fuel." She took the bowl, her hands shaking, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric, a spark of static in the dry air. She ate slowly at first, then ravenously, the etiquette of the city forgotten in the face of starvation. Caleb watched her, leaning back in his chair. The red dress dripped in the background. The wind howled, and for the first time in 10 years, Caleb Thorne wondered if the storm had brought him a curse or a salvation. He watched the firelight dance in her dark eyes and felt a dangerous thaw beginning in the center of his chest, a cracking of the ice he had carefully built around his life. The wind outside had settled into a rhythmic droning moan, a heavy bass note that vibrated through the floorboards, but inside, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to a strange, suspended quiet. Caleb reached into his supply crate and pulled out a single tin can. It was his Christmas present to himself, a luxury hauled all the way from the general store in Laramie, peaches in heavy syrup. He punctured the lid with his knife, the jagged metal curling back to reveal the glistening fruit smelling of sugar and summer. He set it between them on the floorboards like a peace offering. "Christmas dinner," he said, his voice rough. "Don't have a goose, but this'll do." Evelyn looked at the can, then at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It was absurd. 2 strangers trapped in a frozen wooden box, sharing fruit with a hunting knife. She took a slice, the syrup dripping gold onto her thumb, and ate it. The taste was shocking in its sweetness, a violent contrast to the stale air and the metallic tang of fear. For a moment, the cabin didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a chapel. They passed the tin back and forth in silence, the simple act of sharing food breaking down the last of the walls between them. The sugar seemed to revive her, putting color back into her cheeks and a spark of life in her eyes that the cold had tried to extinguish. "Why were you on the stage?" Caleb asked, watching her lick syrup from her finger. "In this weather? In that dress?" It was the question that had been hanging in the smoke-filled air since he carried her in. Evelyn grew still. She looked at the red dress drying near the fire, the silk stiff and water-stained. "I was running," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the wind. "My father, he arranged a match, a banker in Cheyenne, a cruel man with cold eyes and a ledger where his heart should be. The wedding was supposed to be tomorrow." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering not from cold, but from memory. I put on the dress for the fitting and I couldn't take it off. I climbed out the window and paid the driver every cent I had to take me west. I didn't care where, just away. She looked up at Caleb, her chin lifted in defiance. I'd rather freeze in a ravine than live in a gilded cage. Caleb looked at her with new respect. She wasn't a porcelain doll, she was iron wrapped in silk. She had chosen the risk of death over a life without freedom. It was a choice he understood down to his bones. I know about running, he said quietly. I came up here after the war. Too much noise down south. Too many ghosts. Thought if I got high enough, the silence would drown them out. The fire popped, a log settling into ash, and the light dimmed. With the drop in the flame came the return of the cold. It crept out from the corners of the room, invisible and relentless. The draft from the floorboards became a knife blade slicing through the warmth. Caleb stood up to feed the stove, but his woodpile was shrinking. He had to ration it if they were going to last 3 days. He put in 1 log, not 2. Within an hour, the temperature in the cabin began to plummet. He could see his breath in the air, white puffs of mist that dissipated instantly. Evelyn was shaking again, the tremors starting in her hands and spreading to her core. The wool blankets weren't enough. The shock of the crash and the exposure had stripped her reserves. She couldn't generate her own heat fast enough. Caleb watched her, his jaw set. He knew the physics of survival. He knew what hypothermia did, how it lulled you to sleep and then stopped your heart. He also knew what he had to do, and the thought terrified him more than the storm. Evelyn, he said, his voice tight. The wood's low. The fire isn't enough. She looked up, her teeth chattering. I'm okay, she lied. No, Caleb said. You're not. You're going into shock again. If you sleep like that, you won't wake up. He walked over to the narrow bunk built into the wall. It was barely wide enough for one man, filled with straw and covered in a buffalo robe. There's only one way to keep the heat, he said, not looking at her. Shared warmth. Body heat. The silence that followed was heavy. He was a stranger, a rough man of the wild, asking a woman who had fled a marriage to lie down with him. It broke every rule of propriety she had ever known, but the cold didn't care about propriety. The cold only cared about physics. Evelyn looked at him, searching his face for any sign of predation, but she saw only grim practicality and a strange, guarded fear that mirrored her own. She nodded, a jerky motion. Okay, she whispered. Caleb blew out the lantern, plunging the room into the soft, dying glow of the embers. He didn't take off his clothes, neither did she. He lay down on the bunk, pressing his back against the rough log wall, and opened the buffalo robe. Come here, he said gently. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then climbed in beside him. She was freezing, her body like a block of ice against his side. He pulled the heavy furs over them, sealing them in a cocoon of darkness. She faced away from him at first, stiff and trembling, but the instinct for survival was stronger than modesty. She shifted, backing into him, pressing her frozen curves against his solid warmth. Caleb stiffened. The sensation of her, the scent of lavender, the softness of her hair against his jaw, the fragile weight of her, was overwhelming. He had been alone for 5 years. He had forgotten what it felt like to have a human heartbeat next to his. He wrapped an arm around her, purely to hold the blankets tight, his hand resting chastely on her waist. Slowly, the heat began to build. The shivering stopped. Her breathing evened out, matching the rhythm of his own. In the darkness, the storm outside ceased to matter. The world narrowed down to the few inches between them. Caleb lay awake, staring into the dark, listening to the wind and feeling the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest against his arm. It was torture. It was salvation. He realized with a jolt of panic that he didn't want the storm to end. He didn't want the morning to come. Because when the sun rose, the world would return, and he would have to let her go. But for tonight, in the heart of the blizzard, she was his to protect. And that was enough. The morning didn't break. It exploded. The sun crested the eastern peaks and shattered against the miles of fresh snow, filling the cabin with a light so brilliant and absolute it pierced right through the timber walls. Caleb woke not to the sound of wind, but to a silence so profound it felt holy. The screaming gale had vanished, replaced by the soft, rhythmic drip of icicles melting from the eaves. He lay still for a long moment, blinking against the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, acutely aware of the weight against his chest. Evelyn was still asleep, her head tucked under his chin, her arm thrown across his torso as if holding him in place. During the long, dark hours of the night, the desperate huddle for warmth had shifted into something else, an entanglement of limbs and trust that felt alarmingly natural. Her breath was warm against his neck, a steady hush-hush that quieted the chaos in his own blood. For 5 years he had woken up to cold sheets and the empty ache of solitude. Now, there was softness, lavender, and life. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to break the spell. But the day was waiting, and the fire was dead. He carefully extricated himself, sliding out from under the furs. She murmured something in her sleep, reaching for his warmth, and he paused, brushing a stray curl from her forehead with a thumb that felt too rough for such delicate work. He pulled on his boots and heavy coat, the leather stiff with cold, and unbarred the door. It took a solid shove to clear the drift piled against the threshold. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the blinding glare. The world had been scrubbed clean. The jagged rocks, the mud, the scars of the land, all of it was buried under 4 feet of pristine, glittering white. The air was thin and sharp, tasting of ozone and pine. Caleb scanned the horizon. To the east, the pass was completely choked with snow, a wall of white that would take days, maybe a week, to melt or clear. The trail to Laramie was gone. They were cut off, completely isolated from the world of bankers, arranged marriages, and debts. A strange, fierce relief washed over him. He turned back to the cabin. Evelyn was awake, sitting up in the bunk, the buffalo robe pulled to her chin. She looked small in the daylight, her eyes dark and watchful. "Storms broke," Caleb said, kicking the snow off his boots. "But the pass is blocked. Deep drifts. Won't be a horse getting through there for a week at least." He watched her face, waiting for the panic, the disappointment. But she just nodded, looking around the rough cabin as if seeing it for the first time, not as a prison, but as a shelter. Caleb moved to the stove, building the fire up for coffee. The domestic rhythm felt heavy with unspoken questions. In the corner, the red silk dress was dry. It hung stiff and wrinkled, a gaudy relic of a life that felt 1,000 miles away. It looked ridiculous against the rough-hewn logs, a costume from a play that had been cancelled. Evelyn climbed out of the bunk, wrapping the wool blanket around herself like a toga, and walked over to the dress. She reached out and touched the silk, her fingers tracing the lace of the bodice. "I can saddle the gelding when the crust hardens," Caleb said, his back to her, focusing on the coffee pot so he didn't have to look at her leaving. "I can try to break trail south, get you to a ranch, get you back to the city." It was the right thing to offer. It was the honorable thing. It tasted like ash in his mouth. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She took the dress off the hook. For a second, Caleb thought she was going to put it on, to armor herself back into the woman who belonged in a parlor. Instead, she folded it. Not neatly, but with a finality, rolling the silk into a ball. She walked to his supply chest and shoved the dress deep into the bottom, burying the crimson fabric under coils of rope and canvas. She turned to face him, the wool blanket trailing on the floor. She looked wilder than she had yesterday, her hair loose, her feet bare on the wood, her face scrubbed clean of pretense. "I don't want to go back," she said, her voice steady. "I don't want the city. I don't want the banker, and I don't want to be rescued." She took a step toward him. "You said you came here for the silence, Caleb. Is there room in it for me?" Caleb looked at her. This woman who had fallen from the sky, who had survived the ice, who had slept in his arms and chased away the cold. He looked at the empty space in the cabin that had haunted him for years and saw it filled. He walked over to her, closing the distance, and took her hands. They were warm. "It's a hard life," he warned, though his grip on her hands was tight. "It's cold. It's lonely work. The wind never really stops." Evelyn smiled, and it was brighter than the sun on the snow outside. "I'm not afraid of the cold. she whispered, looking up at him. Not anymore. Caleb nodded, a slow, deep acceptance settling in his chest. He let go of her hands, only to reach past her and push the heavy timber door shut. The latch clicked into place, sealing out the blinding white world, sealing out the past. Inside, the fire roared to life, and for the first time in a long time, the cabin was truly warm.